truth. And I come from a very objective scientific background. So everything that we do is based on objective data.
I say this
And
because I was listening to your interview before,
Yeah.
and there were several moments in the interview where you'd reference that. You'd say things like, they don't want you to know this, or they won't tell you this.
No, absolutely. Because, we talk about epiphanies and eureka moments in science, but for me, one of the kind of complete change in paradigm in the way that I think was changed when I was in academia and teaching in medical school and doing research in an academic institution. And you start to think, what we in the scientific community, we've cured every disease. Every disease known to man, we've cured it in rats and mice. So then the question is, why isn't this translated into patient care? Why can't we do this in humans? Number one, in animal experiments, we control their environment. We control their food. We control their light cycle. We control everything about them. You can't do that in humans, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has a different diet. Everybody has different drug therapy that they're on or hygienic practices. But then what I realized was, because when I was in academia, we wanted to create this consortium, a center of excellence for diseases, because my thought process was, Western medicine is siloed, right? If you have a heart problem, you go to a cardiologist. If you've got a GI problem, you go to a gastroenterologist. If you've got a neurological problem, you go to a neurologist or psychiatrist. But none of these disciplines talk to one another. So if you go to that neurologist is going to treat that condition much different than the cardiologist would, much different than the GI doc would. But what if we're looking at the exact same root cause? And so my philosophy, well, let's create a center of excellence and let's bring everybody in the room. Let's bring the GI docs, the neurologists, the cardiologists, the geneticists, the pulmonary docs, the kidney docs, the renal docs. And let's understand this kind of wheel and cog, because everything occurs at the mitochondria, subcellular level, and energy production. And then basically everything can manifest from that. But what I quickly realized when you go to, for instance, MD Anderson and trying to treat cancer, no one is interested in curing cancer. No one is interested in curing human disease. Because the epiphany for me came because medicine is a business. It's a for-profit business. In fact, it's the largest business and economic model in the world, $1 trillion annualized market. And most of these drug companies who influence and pay and support scientific journals, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, the major publications, the major journals, and they're influencing regulation and policy and FDA. And so when you figure out that there's undue influence by these for-profit companies, because the number one rule of business, as you know, as an entrepreneur and a business guy, is acquire a customer and keep that customer as long as you can. Call it lifetime value of that customer. And that's what medicine is. They get you, you acquire you as a customer, they put you on a drug. That drug has side effects. They have to put you on another drug to mitigate the side effects of that drug. Now you get side effects from that polypharmacy. They have to put you on another drug to mitigate those side effects. And now you look up and people who are 50 to 60 years old and older are on 10, 12, 18 different medications. That's the best financial model in the world. So it's a great financial model, but it's at the expense of our health and the health of everybody living in the world. And in the US, we have the sickest population in the world. Now, for the first time in the history of Western medicine, have discussions between physician and patient on how do we wean you off this drug. That conversation has never had before, because it's always, if this doesn't work, come back and I'll prescribe you more drugs. Let's do the opposite. You come back and let's understand the root of cause of disease. Let's say, okay, well, if we are addressing this, you don't need this medication. And if you don't need this medication, you don't need this medication. And now for the first time, you start weaning patients off of drugs. And what happens? You're now impeding upon the market share of these multi-billion-dollar drug companies who make their living buying influence, regulating policy, influencing policy. And the FDA is a stepping stone to a board seat of Big Pharma. Every former FDA official in the US for the past 20 or 30 years goes on to become multi-million-dollar salaried employee from Big Pharma. It has to stop.
Despite spending nearly 20% of the United States GDP on healthcare, the US ranks last overall on health outcomes among high-income countries, including having the highest infant mortality rates and lowest life expectancy. It's like unbelievable.
No, I mean, that's
unbelievable.
depressing. I mean, but those are the facts. And you have to understand those are indisputable data, right? And so when people hear that, they go, but when you look at kind of the system, and I don't blame doctors because doctors get into this field. You know, I was on the admissions committee to UT Medical School for a number of years. So we interviewed a lot of these young kids, figure out what their motivation was. Will they have a successful career in medicine? And almost everyone, I mean, there's always the exception, but everyone gets into medicine because they want to make a difference. They're driven by curiosity, and most of them want to leave a lasting legacy and help people. That's what drives entry into healthcare. But when you look at the system in which they're trained in, it prevents them, it basically handcuffs them. Because when you figure out the economic model of medicine, once you make a diagnosis, now you've got a diagnosable disease to which you have a finite number of responses, right? If you make this diagnosis, that's called an ICD-10 code, which is reimbursable, and that's how you get paid. So once you make a diagnosis, you only have a finite list of things you can do. You can't ask that question and go, well, what's really causing this, and spend 90 minutes with that patient, because most physicians have to see 60, 70, 80 patients a day to pay the bills, to cover their overhead. So it's a factory. You come in, you look at, you've got a transcriber, you make a diagnosis, okay, I'm going to prescribe this medication, come back in 2 weeks or 6 months and we'll see where you are. And then it's a churn, it's a mill. But as you meant, the data don't lie, right? Sickest population, highest infant mortality in the most industrialized nation in the world.
And according to the data, Americans are spending about 13 years of their life living with disease, and that is significantly higher than many other high-income Western countries. So although life expectancy, might be 78, 80 years old, you're going to spend almost 15 years of that time living with disease. So your health span is really probably the more important thing to be focusing on, not your lifespan. And so when we talk about nitric oxide, I've heard you describe it as the molecule of longevity.
For sure.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, again, longevity is this emerging field that's driven by how do we live longer? How do we increase our health span and longevity, right? Because I think we can all agree that nobody wants to live to be 100 years old if we spend the last 25 of that years incapacitated, in a diaper, unable to get out of bed, right? That's not living. So when I look at longevity, I look at kind of what are the hallmarks of longevity? What defines longevity, right? How do we live longer, healthier life free of disease? And really there's three objective measures. There's stem cells. This whole field of regenerative medicine is based on mobilizing our own stem cells or deploying stem cells throughout the body to repair and replace dysfunctional cells.
So these stem cells are cells that can basically act as like Band-Aids, repairs for any part of our body.
Well, we call them pluripotent stem cells. So mean that, and some of these are bone marrow derived, some of these are what we call stromal vascular fraction that you get from the adipose tissue or the fat.
Pluripotent would mean
pluripotent means
powers.
that stem cell can go and become a neuron. That stem cell can go to the heart and become a functional myocyte. It can go and become a macrophage or an immune cell, white blood cell. So pluripotent means it can become many things, whatever it needs to be. In some cases, the amount of stem cells present in our bone marrow get smaller with age. The number of cells decrease with age. But fortunately or unfortunately, the older we get, the more fat we deposit. And so we have a number of stem cells in our fat, so we increase the number of stem cells in our fat. So the problem with aging and longevity is when we lose the ability to mobilize our own stem cells. We can't repair and replace dysfunctional cells. So we have what we call zombie cells or senescent cells. They're there, but they can't do their job. They're dysfunctional. And that's what leads to age. Number two, it's telomeres. And telomeres are the ends of the chromosomes of our DNA. And so they're the very end. So it's like the tips of the shoestrings, right, that prevent the shoestring from fraying.
Yeah.
And those are like the telomeres. So as long as you have a functional telomere and it prevents it from getting shorter, then shorter telomeres, shorter lifespan. Longer telomeres, longer lifespan. So when telomeres get shorter, it decreases our lifespan and longevity. And then the third one is mitochondrial function.
Mm-hmm.
Like every age-related chronic disease, you have a lower number of mitochondria per cell, and mitochondria that are present aren't functional. So you get what's called an uncoupling of the electron transport chain inside the intermitochondrial membrane, and you can no longer effectively produce cellular energy, or ATP. So nitric oxide is the foundational longevity molecule because nitric oxide is the signal in the body that tells our stem cells to mobilize and differentiate. Without nitric oxide, you have less number of circulating stem cells. Nitric oxide activates the enzyme telomerase, which prevents telomere shortening. Without nitric oxide, you don't get activation of telomerase, telomeres shorten. And then nitric oxide is the signal in the cell that tells the cell, I need more mitochondria, and I need these mitochondria to be more efficient, generate more cellular energy with less oxygen. So when you restore nitric oxide, you address all three aspects of longevity. And there's no other molecule in the body that does that.
You know Brian Johnson, don't you?
Yes.
What do you think of Brian Johnson?
You know, I would never replicate or try to do what he does. I don't think it's the proper approach. You know, and I don't mean to criticize people because this whole field of biohacking, you know, you get people who have no science background, no medical background, no biochemical background, and yet they're out there influencing millions of people that follow them. And many times they're giving really bad advice, not intentionally, it's because of ignorance. They just don't know. They don't know the science. They don't know the medicine behind it. So before you go and follow any influencer or biohacker, number one, look at their credentials. And if they don't have any science background, if they're, you know, formal technologist or, you know, come from anything besides science and medicine, you really need to do a little bit of deep dive and make sure that what they're giving you is scientifically valid or recommending.
He seems to be a fan of the role of nitric oxide as it relates to longevity, though. He seems to have said positive things about nitric oxide and its impact on improving your cardiovascular health.
Yeah, I think as we advance the science and we do more to communicate the complex science into, you know, layman's terms where the non-scientists, non-medical professionals can understand it and appreciate it, I think more people are going to pick up to that. But there's also some well-known biohackers with influences of, you know, millions of people that still say that nitric oxide is a toxin that inhibits mitochondrial respiration and it should be avoided.
Is there such thing as having too much nitric oxide, though? Because if people hear this conversation today and they rush out and they, I don't know, overdo their nitric oxide by doing a bunch of therapies,
Yeah.
Is that a risk?
Absolutely. You know, we know water is essential, right? But we can drink too much water and kill ourselves. You see it on the news, you know, a couple times a year called hypotonic lysis. So yeah, dose dictates poison. And so what we have to do is maintain the integrity of the field to make sure that if there are nitric oxide products out there, that number one, you don't overdo it and lead to, you know, health issues or kill a consumer, kill a patient, because that could kill the entire field. But we also understand that there's only two signs of toxicity for nitric oxide. So it's really pretty straightforward. Number one, if you take too much nitric oxide, you're going to get an unsafe drop in blood pressure. Because think about this, if you take nitric oxide or you're enhancing nitric oxide production through whatever means, it's going to lead to systemic vasodilation. Now you've got that same volume of blood pumping through much larger pipes, and you're going to have a drop in blood pressure. And if you lose perfusion pressure, you're not going to be able to perfuse the brain because you got to pump against gravity, and you're going to get lightheaded and you'll pass out. And if that's prolonged, it leads to ischemic end organ damage and organ failure, and it can be deadly. So that's number one. And then number two is a condition called methemoglobinemia. And that's a big word, meaning that it oxidizes the iron of hemoglobin and reduces your oxygen carrying capacity. So you'll become cyanotic. You'll get blue around the lips. Your extremities will turn, white from lack of perfusion or lack of oxygen. But you never see that. I mean, you really never see clinical methemoglobinemia. Fortunately, your blood pressure will drop to an unsafe level long before you get any accumulation of methemoglobinemia.
So on this point of longevity then, one of the points you mentioned there was telomere length. And I've heard about telomere length because I've heard about studies they've done in rats and I think other rodents around telomere length. So it was discovered that individuals with shorter telomeres had a death rate